It was a scorching afternoon in my hometown when I sat under the big Iroko tree, staring at Uncle Emeka's crumbling house. The walls were peeling, the paint long gone, and the roof sagged like it had given up on life. Everything about the house looked tired, old, and forgotten. But what struck me most wasn't the house, it was the deep, rattling coughs I could hear coming from inside. They echoed like they had nowhere else to go. Uncle Emeka had once been the pride of our village. Everyone spoke about him with admiration. He had money, a big house, cars, and everything that seemed to mean success back then. People looked up to him. They said, Emeka is living the good life. But now, the same man was barely surviving. His house was falling apart, and he couldn't even afford proper medical care. I'd heard whispers of what had happened, but no one told the full story. Curiosity got the better of me, and that's what pushed me to visit him that day. Uncle, I called out after knocking on the creaky wooden door. My voice felt small compared to the heavy silence of the afternoon. It's me, Kin. Can I come in? There was a pause, and then I heard his weak voice. Come in, my son. When I stepped into the room, the smell of old wood, dust, and medicine hit me immediately. The house was dimly lit, with only a small window letting in a ray of sunlight. Uncle Emeka sat on a worn-out chair, wrapped in a blanket even though the heat outside was unbearable. His once strong frame had withered, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the blanket around him. He looked much older than his age. Seeing him like that made my chest tighten. Sit down, Kin, he said, gesturing to a stool nearby. It's been a long time since anyone came to visit me. What brings you here today? I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to start. But then I decided to be honest. Uncle, I said, everyone in the village talks about how much you had back in the day. They say you were the richest man around. But, what happened? How did things change so much? Uncle Emeka's face grew serious, and he let out a deep sigh. Oh, Kin, he said, shaking his head slowly. That's a long story. But if you're willing to listen, I'll tell you. Just promise me one thing, learn from my mistakes. I nodded eagerly. I promise, Uncle. And so, Uncle Emeka began his story. He told me how, in his younger years, he had been a trader. He dealt in textiles and traveled far and wide, buying and selling goods. Business was good, and the money flowed in steadily. I was making more money than I ever thought possible, he said, a faint smile appearing on his face for the first time. Back then, it felt like the good times would never end. With his growing wealth, Emeka built the biggest house in the village. He bought cars that turned heads and hosted parties that people talked about for weeks. I wanted everyone to see that I was successful, he admitted. I thought life was about enjoying what you have today. After all, tomorrow isn't promised, right? But tomorrow did come, and it wasn't what he expected. One day, a fire broke out in his warehouse, destroying most of his goods. It was the beginning of my troubles, he said, his voice dropping. I lost half of my stock, and the insurance I'd paid for didn't cover everything. That was my first mistake. I didn't understand how important it was to protect my business properly. Soon after, a bad investment wiped out most of his savings. Emeka had trusted a friend who promised him quick profits, but the deal fell apart, leaving him with nothing. I thought I could rebuild, he said, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. But by then, I was already in my 50s. My energy wasn't the same, and people didn't trust me like they used to. He paused and looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. Kin, I didn't prepare for this part of life. I thought I'd always have money coming in, that I'd always have strength to work. But life doesn't work like that. His words hit me hard. How could someone who once had so much end up with so little? I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, listening. You see, my son, he continued, life is full of seasons. When you're young, you have energy. You can work, hustle, and make things happen. But when you're old, things change. Your body slows down, and people stop calling you for opportunities. That's when you realize the importance of planning ahead. He gestured around the room. Look at this house. I spent so much money building it, thinking it would take care of me when I was old. But a house can't feed you. A house can't pay for medicine or electricity. I should have put that money into something that could grow, land I could rent out, a business that could run without me, or even simple savings in the bank. Emeka's voice grew quieter, almost as if he was speaking to himself. I didn't think about what would happen when I couldn't work anymore. And now, here I am, depending on others for even the smallest things. I looked around the room again, taking in the cracked walls and the empty shelves. I could see the pain in Uncle Emeka's eyes, the weight of his regrets. His story was a warning, a glimpse into what could happen if I didn't think about the future. "Kin," he said, breaking the silence, "promise me one thing. Don't wait until it's too late. Start planning now, even if it's just a little. Learn from my mistakes." I nodded, my throat tight. "I will, Uncle." As I left his house that day, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the village. But all I could think about was Uncle Mbaisa's words. His story had opened my eyes in a way nothing else could. I didn't know it yet, but that conversation under the Iroko tree would change my life forever. When I got home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about Uncle Emeka's story. It played over and over in my mind, like a warning bell that refused to be ignored. I sat outside, watching the stars, and started asking myself questions I had never considered before. What would happen to me when I got old? Would I have enough to take care of myself? Or would I end up like Uncle Emeka, struggling and full of regrets? The next morning, I decided to visit him again. I wanted to know more, not just about what went wrong, but about what he would do differently if he could go back. When I arrived, he was sitting outside, soaking in the morning sun. He looked surprised to see me. "Kin, you're back," he said, a small smile on his face. "What brings you here so early?" "Uncle," I said, pulling up a chair beside him, "you told me about your mistakes yesterday. But I want to know, if you could start over, what would you do differently?" Uncle Emeka's smile faded, and he nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good question, my son. Let me tell you." He leaned forward, his voice steady and clear. "First," he said, "I would save." It sounds so simple, doesn't it? But back then, I thought saving was only for people who didn't have enough money to spend. I thought I was too rich to save. That was my biggest mistake. If I had saved even a small part of what I earned every month, I would have had something to fall back on when things went wrong. Second, he continued, I would invest in things that could grow over time. Instead of spending money on parties and expensive cars, I should have bought land, started a farm, or opened a shop that could run without me. These are the things that keep giving back, even when you're no longer able to walk. He paused, his eyes searching mine to make sure I understood. And third, Kin, I would plan for the future. You see, when you're young and strong, it's easy to think that things will always be this way. But life doesn't stay the same. The energy you have now won't last forever. That's why you must think ahead. You must plan for the day when you can no longer work as hard as you do now. I started asking myself deeper questions. What kind of lifestyle do I want when I retire? How much would I need to live comfortably without stress? And most importantly, how do I ensure I get there? That's when I learned about retirement planning. It wasn't just a fancy term, it was a simple, practical way to take control of the future. I began by tracking my expenses, setting long-term goals, and putting money into safe investments. It wasn't easy at first, but the thought of having enough for my older years motivated me.